Orlando Jones didn't disappear. He didn't quit, and he didn't lose his talent. What happened to him was quieter and far more disturbing than a scandal headline. In a business that rewards silence and punishes resistance, Orlando Jones chose to speak, and the moment he did, everything around him began to collapse. For years, audiences knew him as the sharp voice in the room, the man who could make people laugh while telling uncomfortable truths. But behind the scenes, that voice became a problem. Not because it was wrong, but because it was too clear, too political, and too difficult to control. This is not a story about a role being cut. It's a story about power, erasure, and what happens when one man refuses to soften his message. The role that changed everything. Orlando Jones had already lived several careers before American Gods ever entered his life, and each one quietly prepared him for what was about to happen. He was a writer who understood how stories are built and dismantled, an actor who understood rhythm and timing, and a comedian who understood how to tell the truth without asking for permission. Long before he ever put on the skin of a trickster god, Jones had learned how power reacts when it feels challenged. So when he was cast as Mr. Nancy, also known as Anansi, the African trickster god, he wasn't stepping into just another television role. He was stepping into a voice that history had rarely allowed to speak freely. From the very beginning, Mr. Nancy stood apart. He was not designed to blend into the background or soften the edges of the story. He wasn't there for decorative mythology or comic relief. Under Orlando Jones' interpretation, the character became sharp, confrontational, and deliberately uncomfortable. Mr. Nancy spoke about slavery, survival, and the psychological scars passed down through generations. He didn't rely on symbolism that could be ignored or reinterpreted later. He said exactly what he meant, directly to the audience, without apology. That directness wasn't accidental. It was the point. What made the role even more unusual was the level of trust Jones was initially given behind the scenes. When the show's original leadership welcomed his perspective, something rare happened in television. Jones wasn't just hired to deliver lines. He was invited into the process of shaping the character itself. After major changes in leadership disrupted the production, Jones moved even deeper into the creative structure of the show. He didn't just offer opinions, he contributed to writing. He helped structure character arcs. He worked on key moments that held the season together, including the finale. And crucially, his contributions weren't limited to black characters. He helped shape women, LGBTQ characters, and characters of color across the board, bringing coherence to a show struggling with instability. For a brief moment, it looked like genuine progress. A performer was trusted not just with performance, but with authorship. A black actor was allowed to help define how African mythology collided with modern America on a major television series. The show found its sharpest edge in that collaboration, and Mr. Nancy became one of its most talked-about figures. He wasn't just memorable, he was necessary. He challenged the audience, the narrative, and the comfort level of everyone watching. But that same voice soon became a liability. As American Gods continued to evolve, the environment around it shifted. Leadership changed again, priorities shifted. The appetite for confrontation began to fade. What once felt bold and essential now felt dangerous to people sitting in decision-making positions who did not share the lived experience behind the words. Mr. Nancy stopped being viewed as a character and started being treated as a problem. His anger, his clarity, and his refusal to soften the message made people uncomfortable. At that point, Mr. Nancy was no longer just part of the story. He had become a statement, and not everyone wanted that statement delivered. The stage was set for a rupture. Orlando Jones didn't yet know how quietly it would happen, or how easily the work he helped build could be pushed aside. But the role that changed everything had already done its job. It had spoken, and once spoken, it couldn't be unheard. The day he was silenced. The end did not come with a meeting. It did not come with a warning. and it did not come with paperwork. According to Orlando Jones, the decision was delivered on September 10th, a date that would later become the center of confusion, contradiction, and quiet damage. In some accounts, that date was cited as 1 year, in others, another. But what never changed was the core fact. Orlando Jones was told he would no longer be part of American Gods moving forward. There would be no more Mr. Nancy. Jones did not hear this from the people he worked with day to day. He did not hear it from the creatives who had praised his contributions or thanked him for salvaging storylines after months of instability. Instead, the message came indirectly, stripped of context and stripped of respect. When he asked for formal termination paperwork, none arrived. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. During that time, Jones says his professional rights were effectively frozen. He could not move forward freely. He could not plan. He could not work elsewhere without clarity. And yet, the show continued. Without him. When Jones finally spoke publicly, it was not measured. It was not diplomatic. It was raw. In a video posted to his social media, he made it clear that the decision was not creative in nature, at least not in the way studios usually frame such exits. According to Jones, the new leadership believed the character of Mr. Nancy sent the wrong message to Black America. Too angry, too confrontational, too effective. Jones described a scenario familiar to many in the industry, a white decision-maker in power, surrounded by assurances that removing a politically charged Black character was the responsible choice. Not because the writing was weak, not because audiences rejected it, but because it challenged comfort. Almost immediately, responses followed. The production company released a statement insisting that race played no role, that the character was simply not part of the story direction going forward. Another statement disputed even minor details Jones mentioned, focusing on technicalities rather than substance. But none of those statements addressed the deeper issue Jones raised. Why was the most politically resonant character removed at the exact moment the show sought to evolve, and why did that evolution require silence? For Orlando Jones, the answer was already clear. He hadn't just lost a role. He had been erased from a conversation he helped create. When the pattern became impossible to ignore. What turned Orlando Jones's story from a personal firing into a public reckoning was not just what happened to him, but who recognized it immediately. Shortly after Jones spoke out, he directed his frustration toward the company behind the show, Fremantle. In a series of posts, he described the treatment he received in blunt terms, calling it second-class, cruel, and calculated. He did not frame it as a misunderstanding. He framed it as a pattern. Then something unexpected happened. Gabrielle Union reached out. Her response was short, public, and unmistakable. She didn't debate facts. She didn't ask for proof. She recognized the tone, the timing, and the damage. And she said what many in Hollywood avoid saying out loud, that these situations rarely exist in isolation. At the time, Union was dealing with her own fallout from a show produced by the same company. She had raised concerns about workplace culture, about racial insensitivity, about being told that aspects of her identity were unacceptable for mainstream audiences. Her punishment was not loud either. It came quietly, professionally framed, and without admission of wrongdoing. What connected these stories wasn't genre or platform. It was process. In both cases, individuals spoke up. In both cases, their concerns were reframed as inconveniences. In both cases, official statements focused on technical explanations while ignoring emotional and professional harm. And in both cases, the people affected were expected to move on quietly. Jones did not. He described months of being stalled without clarity, a limbo that prevented him from exercising full control over his career. He described being praised privately while dismissed publicly. And he described a system that benefits from ambiguity, where nothing is ever explicit enough to challenge, but everything is effective enough to remove you. Union later revealed she had sat through a long meeting with executives, laying out her experience in full detail. She described it as candid, productive, but unresolved. Because acknowledgement does not equal change. For Jones, Union support mattered not because it fixed anything, but because it confirmed something. That what happened to him wasn't random. It wasn't personal failure. And it wasn't about talent. It was about who gets to decide which voices are acceptable and when those voices become too inconvenient to keep. The work that was left behind. By the time Orlando Jones was removed from American Gods, much of his work was already embedded into the show's DNA. That reality made the silence that followed even harder to accept. Jones had not been a passive performer waiting for direction. After the departure of earlier leadership, he stepped into a vacuum. He helped define character motivations, relationships, and arcs during a period when the show was struggling to find stability. He contributed to scripts. He shaped dialogue. He worked on the season finale at a time when the production was under pressure to hold itself together. And yet, when the show moved forward without him, none of that work was publicly acknowledged. What replaced Mr. Nancy was not a reinterpretation. It was an absence, a removal that altered the balance of the story while pretending nothing essential had been lost. The character who once addressed history directly was no longer there to do so. The voice that challenged the audience was gone, and the narrative adjusted accordingly. Jones later explained that the issue was never about whether the character stayed or left. It was about process, about respect, about conversation. Decisions were made without dialogue, without transparency, and without the basic recognition owed to someone who had helped carry the creative burden of the series. What hurt most was not the erasure itself, but the rewriting of reality afterward. Statements emphasized evolving storylines and source material while avoiding the contributions that had already been made. It was as if the work had existed only as long as it was convenient. For Jones, this wasn't just a professional loss. It was the realization that authorship does not protect you when power shifts. You can help build the house and still be locked out without explanation. Speaking up in a business built on silence. Hollywood does not punish failure as harshly as it punishes resistance. Orlando Jones understood that long before American Gods. But speaking out still came with consequences. When he chose to go public, Jones did not hedge his words. He did not dilute his message. He described the experience as demeaning and inequitable, pointing to a system that can quietly stall a career without ever issuing a formal dismissal. He spoke about how creative control becomes leverage and how delays become weapons. The response from the industry was predictable. Some expressed sympathy privately, others distanced themselves publicly. Official statements focused on clarifying minor inaccuracies instead of addressing the broader claims. The conversation shifted away from impact and toward optics. What Jones was describing went beyond one show. He connected his experience to a larger issue of control, how studios can sit on an artist's rights, limit their movement, and effectively suppress opportunity without openly admitting to doing so. It was not dramatic. It was administrative, and that made it harder to challenge. Jones framed it as a modern version of an old problem. Not ownership of bodies, but ownership of access, of time, of permission to work. And once that access is restricted, the damage compounds quietly. Still, he did not retreat. He continued to speak, to give interviews, to tell the story in full sentences, with context, and with names where he felt they mattered. He did so knowing that the industry prefers amnesia over accountability. For Orlando Jones, silence was no longer an option. Even if speaking cost him comfort, it preserved something more important: his agency. What remains after the noise fades? Time has a way of softening headlines, but it sharpens consequences. Long after the public debate moved on, Orlando Jones was left to rebuild in an industry that rarely welcomes dissenters back easily. He continued working, he continued acting, he continued writing. But the absence of Mr. Nancy remained symbolic, not because the character was gone, but because of what his removal represented. A line drawn, a message deemed too disruptive, a boundary enforced without apology. Jones shifted focus toward his family, toward projects that offered more control, and toward conversations that mattered to him. He spoke openly about wanting a different future for his children, one where inequitable treatment is named early, not normalized through endurance. What makes his story tragic is not that he lost a role. It's that the system he challenged continues to operate largely unchanged, quietly, efficiently, with plausible deniability. And yet, there is something unresolved in that tragedy. Because Jones did not disappear, his voice did not break, and his story remains on record, waiting to be re-examined as more people begin to recognize the patterns he described. Some careers end with applause, others end with questions. Orlando Jones's story belongs to the latter, and those questions are still unanswered. Do you think Orlando Jones was punished for being too outspoken, or was this simply a creative decision taken too far? Should actors who help shape stories have a say in how those stories evolve? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if this story made you pause, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the moments Hollywood would rather you forget.